All right, where were we? Jonathan Harker wakes up the next day, and, well, I should say he, wakes up and it's pretty late in the day because his sleep schedule has been absolutely whack. And he notices that he's getting a little bit scruffy. So he gets out his shaving kit and he begins to shave his face. And luckily for him, even though there are no mirrors in his room, he brought his own very little kind of carry mirror, these tiny travel mirrors. They even have them back in those days. And he's shaving his face when all of a sudden Dracula comes into his room, and Dracula says something like, I'm glad that you're awake. I just wanted to check and see if you... And then Dracula sees the mirror, and he goes absolutely insane. Jonathan Harker has never seen Dracula start to act like this. He gets really angry, and he says, "What is that?" Jonathan Harker, half shaved, half his face has cream all over it still. He's like, "Oh, this is a shaving mirror." And Jonathan Harker turns back to glance at the shaving mirror, and he can't put his finger on it at first, but something is really weird. And he turns back to Dracula, and then back to the mirror, and realizes Dracula isn't showing up in the reflection. And the realization makes Jonathan Harker's heart drop. This is weird. And to make it weirder, Dracula, while the realization that something is very off about that fact just runs across Jonathan Harker's face, Dracula takes 2 huge strides across the room, grabs the mirror, and says, "You won't be needing this," and just chucks it out the window. Just whoop! Straight out the window that had a small opening in it. And Jonathan Harker just sees his little mirror go woo all the way down, thousands of feet. And Jonathan Harker rushes to the window, looks down, and just sees this little smash of glass a zillion feet, below him on this cliffside. And Jonathan Harker sort of just stares out into the sky and thinks that this one was weird, okay? His British sensibilities of being a good guest and maybe seeing some cultural differences is starting to crack and crumble under Dracula really starting to freak him out. And Jonathan Harker starts to think, and Dracula says, "I will be leaving you. Again, I have some business to attend to. I cannot join you for your next meal." And Jonathan Harker says, "You know what? Actually," he thinks, "I don't think I've ever seen this guy eat. Isn't that weird? I'm sure he eats, right? But the mirror thing." And then he starts to think about how weird he looks, Dracula, and how pale he is. Jonathan Harker doesn't know what's going on, but something is completely off. So a couple days pass, and Dracula, always at night, joins Jonathan after his meal, and they just talk about England. Dracula's constantly drilling him on English and his intonation and his accent, really trying to get it down. And Jonathan really realizes that this really creepy man fully intends on moving to England. And the more that Jonathan gets to know Dracula, the less he likes him. Dracula, when they're done with English lessons, tells Jonathan about how much he misses the olden days. But when Dracula says the olden days, Jonathan Harker gets the feeling that he's talking about the Middle Ages olden days. He talks about wars and battles and bloodshed around Transylvania that Jonathan Harker, who is not a historian, but feels that maybe it was a pretty long time ago, depending on because of how ancient the weaponry Dracula describes and how bloody and just brutal that the wars were. Jonathan seems that the battles, he doesn't recognize them at all. And if they were more modern, maybe they would be a little more recognizable and he would know a little bit what is happening in the region. But Dracula's describing things that almost seem ancient. And so, again, this is just another oddity that Jonathan Harker is dealing with this guy. And what's still weirder is every time Jonathan Harker tries to go outside this room or this library, everything is locked. The door is constantly locked. Dracula can seem to get out, and he has a key, but Jonathan Harker, every time he tries it, it's been locked. And Dracula, when questioned about it, says, I told you, this is where you need to be. The other parts of the castle can be very uncomfortable and are not fit for guests. And this is just weird to Jonathan Harker. So, one night, when Dracula leaves a little bit early, and it's still nighttime, Jonathan Harker can't get to sleep. His sleep schedule is completely whacked. And he goes and stares outside his window, kind of thinking about the experience with the little glass mirror, when all of a sudden, down and to his left, Jonathan Harker sees another balcony. And stepping out onto that balcony into the moonlit night is none other than Dracula. And Jonathan Harker didn't know that Dracula was down there. He didn't really even notice the balcony before, but there the man is. And for a moment, Jonathan Harker wants to call out to him, like, hey, how you doing? You know, having trouble sleeping? But something stops him, you know. And he notices that Dracula's just like breathing in the night, like enjoying the fresh air. And Jonathan's like shrugs. He's like, you know, I can understand that. You know, he's a pretty weird, eccentric guy. Not sure what it was, the weird mirror. I'd never seen him eat. The door is locked. But really, I think I'm really overreacting. I'm sure everything is fine. And then Dracula goes to the wall next to the balcony and starts to climb down the face of the wall upside down, like crawling down it like a freaking lizard or something. And this really blows Jonathan Harker's mind. All of a sudden, all holds are gone. This is blowing his little English brain. This is just too much. At this point, Jonathan Harker nearly faints. He like blinks a couple times and looks again at Dracula, and Dracula's straight up, his cape like flowing out behind him, almost like it's immune to gravity. He's just scaling down this wall like a creature out of a nightmare until he disappears into the darkness of the night, you know, a couple 100 feet down. And Jonathan, I mean, he is really freaking out now. So he goes back, he doesn't get any sleep, you know, it becomes daytime again, and he is able to get a little bit more sleep. But he wakes up the next day, and he just decides, I've got to find a way to escape. I'm not sure that I'm going to survive living with Dracula. In fact, Jonathan hasn't brought it up, but he gets the feeling that maybe after Dracula learns all of the English he needs to, Jonathan Harker may not be making a trip back home. And so he starts to plot an escape. His first thought is the door, but it is always locked. Every time Dracula leaves, he locks it. And a couple days pass, and Jonathan Harker's trying to think, okay, what do I do? And then another night, you know, that's about to turn into day happens, and Dracula goes to the balcony again, and Jonathan Harker witnesses him climb down the wall in the creepy, like, villain Spider-Man, you know, style. And then he gets an idea. Even though it's insanely risky, Jonathan Harker decides to try and climb outside his window, scale the wall, and make his way to Dracula's balcony, because he bets that there are some unlocked doors in there. Well, Jonathan Harker doesn't like heights, but this is his only shot. And frankly, he thinks that he would rather die falling to his death than wait indefinitely for whatever Dracula has in store for him. So he goes out, creaks open his window, takes a look at the wall, and this is ancient stone, so there are plenty of handholds and footholds, but he still thousands of feet up, and there are super sharp rocks that a super creepy salamander pale man, if you're not one of those, would be super scared of falling onto. Dracula is whatever he is. Jonathan Harker is not that. So he scales out into the wall, inch by inch, until finally he lets go of his own balcony, and he is just in the air. And he inches his way down and over to Dracula's balcony, and against all odds, he makes it. And he gasps, gets on the balcony, and he realizes that he may not have a lot of time. And he's not sure he can make the trip back up. He may have to find his door back into his regular room, and that becomes his new plan. He thinks, maybe tonight I can find my door again, and then maybe subsequent nights after this, if I have more time, I can try and plan an escape. So he just decides to try and find his room again, but Dracula's right about one thing. The castle itself is a complete maze, and Jonathan Harker has no context into where everything is. He just kind of knows that he's up and to the side, maybe. But before he goes out into the maze of the castle, I forgot to mention Dracula's room is very ornate. It's old. There's sort of like red bed sheets and like gold laced woodwork on the bed, and the cabinets are super, old and handmade, and they look like they've been used for hundreds of years almost. And Jonathan Harker just figures Dracula inherited him or something. He's still having trouble coming to terms with that. There may be something even freaky or supernatural happening. But what really does catch Jonathan Harker's eye is a massive pile of gold in one corner. And what's crazy is this gold has dust all over it. It looks like it hasn't been touched in like decades. There is like a solid amount of untouched dust on this pile of a fortune. And Jonathan Harker just stares at it, his mouth dropped. He's like, wow, this Dracula count is loaded. But he is not worrying about that right now. He isn't really thinking about that right now, because something that's way more valuable than money is life. And so he goes out into the maze of the castle and tries and find his room again, and also just become acquainted with the layout, but he's completely lost. Within just a couple minutes, he's completely turned around, and he starts to get tired all of a sudden. He gets into this one wing where a lot of things are dusty. It seems like this wing of the castle hasn't been used in some time, and Jonathan Harker's starting to realize that maybe Dracula had a point. Maybe it wasn't just stay into your room because that's where you belong, but this really wasn't guest friendly, and he's lost and he starts to get tired, and so he stops in what he assumes to be just kind of a long hallway that branches off into a bunch of different bedrooms maybe, and he finds a bench with these two red pillows on it. It's not very comfortable, but it is somewhere where he can lay down. And he just rationalizes that I'm going to sleep the night here. Someone will find me, probably Dracula, because he's the only one in the castle. I've never seen another servant. And when he does, I might get a reprimand, but he'll lead me back to my room. I'll remember it for next time, and I can try again later and maybe not come this way. And Jonathan Harker begins to try and fall asleep. Well, he wakes up, and it seems that the entire atmosphere of the hallway has changed to almost have a mirror glass-like ambiance. There were giant windows that are pouring in moonlight, and it's reflecting off the crystal lined in the walls and in the chandeliers above him, and it creates this eerie, almost, unearthly sort of feeling. And he notices that he is not alone. Standing in the hallway, just a couple feet away from him, are three pale women with bright red lips and stunningly white, sharp they all have their eyes fixed on him and they smile.